Dwarves are a short but formidable enemy race from fantasy worlds. Despite their size, dwarves are fierce warriors and a powerful race capable of conquering and defending captured territories. In fantasy settings, they fight against various opponents, including those who are taller and stronger. In this episode, we will try to understand how viable dwarves are as a race and whether they could truly be such a powerful people in reality, based on the established rules of their world. And so, let's begin the analysis. I'll start by saying that when considering the combat abilities of dwarves, it's necessary to look at the big picture, because it doesn't make sense to view it in isolation. In the case of dwarves, their military power is heavily influenced by a developed economy. It so happens that dwarves reside in strategically important regions for the development of any state, namely the mountains. Metals lie relatively close to the surface, metals that are used to forge weapons, armor, and everything else that made medieval civilization truly powerful. This is precisely why ancient Rome achieved such power and became the cradle of European civilization. They had access to a vast amount of natural resources, suitable for exploitation. This also applies to the mountains located in the territory of modern Italy, from which the Roman Empire originated. Of course, just metals, precious stones, and dwarves won't be enough for survival. For life, essential resources are needed, namely water and provisions. I'm not a great expert on the lore of dwarves and their people, but I assume there shouldn't be any problems with water underground, given the presence of subterranean rivers and lakes. However, food is a more complicated matter. If dwarves don't cultivate particularly calorie-rich underground mushrooms, they would need to establish a centralized food supply from the outside. This can easily be done through trade with neighboring states. But if the dwarves quarrel with their neighbors and they impose an embargo on bread and meat, the dwarves would starve to death, as they do not have their own agriculture. Hunting and gathering alone cannot provide enough food for entire cities of 1,000 or tens of thousands of people. But let's imagine that they have no issues with provisions, and every dwarf state operates on autarky. This means a system of closed community reproduction with minimal reliance on trade with the outside world. At the same time, they have plenty of iron, precious metals, and gemstones. Could such a setup create a powerful military state? Absolutely, no problem at all. Especially if they have magical energy sources that serve as an alternative to wood, coal, or combustible mixtures needed to melt metal. But even within the mountains, combustible materials like oil are plentiful. A state with such an abundance of resources could afford to equip each dwarf with powerful armor, as shown in films. Moreover, the quality of armor and weapons would be exceptionally high, as dwarves have spent centuries perfecting their blacksmithing skills. They simply had an abundance of raw materials and time to study the properties of metals, as well as to conduct various experiments with them. This is why, drawing a parallel with real history, Italy and Germany in the 15th century were centers of the production of the best armor and weapons in all of Europe, and perhaps even in the world. The dwarves would have had a similar story. In particular, it is common for fantasy dwarves to invent new types of weapons by medieval standards, such as gunpowder firearms like in the movie Warcraft. A civilization like this would inevitably move to a new level of technology, surpassing its contemporaries in military affairs. Therefore, in economic terms, the dwarves are undeniably the strongest race in fantasy. However, a developed economy alone cannot win battles against neighbors. What about the dwarves' direct combat abilities? We will examine dwarves in battle both as individual combat units and as a collective force in battle formations. One dwarf in combat against a taller, stronger opponent will perform based on their equipment. If we compare the same dwarf to a human, it may seem that the human has all the advantages in terms of limb length. But the dwarf also has implicit advantages that will only become evident if they choose the right weaponry. If we give the dwarf a short sword and a shield, at least one that covers their knees, we will get an iron barrel capable of withstanding an immense amount of damage. Destroying such a dwarf would only be possible by landing a piercing strike to the face or the joints of their armor. For the dwarf's opponent, this would be a very challenging task, while a slashing blow would have no effect at all. At the same time, the dwarf would strive to close the distance between himself and his opponent, to prevent the opponent from utilizing the advantage of their longer limbs. Once the dwarf gets into a clinch, it would be very easy for him to kill his opponent with short and swift thrusts, while the opponent's long limbs would make it extremely uncomfortable for them to fight at such a close range. Defeating a dwarf is certainly possible, but only if you know in advance who you will be fighting, as this opponent is very specific, and defeating him on the fly is a more difficult task. Ideally, one should at least have training experience, battling opponents with similar or identical anthropological features. Undoubtedly, if a human weighs 120 kilograms and wields a blunt weapon instead of a sword, this would already make the situation more difficult for the dwarf. A blunt weapon strike delivers strong blunt force trauma, which is not easily mitigated by plate armor. Moreover, a shield could be broken. The next blow to the head could result in unconsciousness, followed by the dwarf's death. The opponent would simply finish him off while our mountain dweller is unconscious. But such weaponry would only be chosen by a warrior who knows exactly who and how he will be fighting. In any case, hitting the dwarf's head is still a challenge, especially if he's holding a shield due to his short but very muscular arms. The dwarf can quickly contract his muscles and make swift shield movements, so the opponent won't even have time to strike the vulnerable zones. One might think that it's easy to knock a dwarf to the ground, considering he's small and in any case weighs less than a human. But this is far from true. A dwarf's short stature, short limbs, and relatively high mass together give him a very low center of gravity. Therefore, even a strong kick to the front will have no effect, especially if the dwarf additionally bends his knees. Therefore, I believe that a sword and shield are the ideal weaponry for a dwarf, not a mace or an axe as often depicted in fantasy. The authors typically assume that a dwarf needs to compensate for his height with a longer lever weapon, but in reality that would only hinder him. In tight spaces, even dual-wielding staves won't help, as these weapons are meant for open spaces. This is not the case with a short sword, which would be a versatile weapon. So even in close combat, a dwarf with a sword and shield is a very dangerous opponent. Now let's consider the dwarf army. Here, the enemy has to deal not with a single mountain warrior, but with an entire military contingent, which, thanks to smart tactics, can show very impressive results. So, what tactics will be effective for a dwarf army? Of course, an army is a combination of different branches of the military, and their effective cooperation will determine the victory or defeat of the entire army. The army composition should include infantry, archers, and cavalry. Cavalry could also serve as archers, but more on that later. Since dwarves are a wealthy people, they can equip their entire infantry with armor, which automatically turns them into heavy infantry. Combined with the unique characteristics of dwarves' physiology and their fighting spirit, heavy dwarven infantry is capable of withstanding any cavalry charge. The primary effect of cavalry on infantry was psychological. The main goal was to make infantrymen panic and flee as a wave of riders charged toward them. Once that happened, cavalry would simply cut them down from behind. However, trained and disciplined infantry would stand their ground, forming tight formations with spears bristling outward. In such cases, the horses charging head-on would be impaled on the spears, and the riders would be brought down and finished off on the ground. The only reliable way to eliminate such infantry was by attacking from a distance using bows or crossbows, but this was only effective if the soldiers weren't protected by full armor. In reality, such armor was extremely expensive and could only be afforded by wealthy knights, who usually fought on horseback. Dwarven heavy infantry, on the other hand, not only has exceptional mental resilience, but also wears nearly impenetrable armor. That makes them practically immune to arrows. In The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, there's a good example of dwarven phalanx tactics, though the scene where one dwarf stands on another's shoulders is absurd and physically unrealistic. Still, aside from that, the formation itself is well presented. But a strong, heavily armored infantry locked in pure defense won't win battles on its own. Dwarves might hope the enemy makes a mistake and charges into their spears, but relying on enemy errors makes the entire strategy too passive. To increase overall effectiveness, the army needs an active component. Cavalry usually fills this role, but due to their short stature, dwarves simply can't ride horses. They're physically unable to mount and control them effectively. That's why they need smaller mounts, like pigs or rams, just like in The Hobbit. Unfortunately, piglets or rams just can't stand up to horse cavalry because horses are simply 5 times heavier and will easily trample them. So, a frontal charge by dwarves in open fields is a losing tactic from the start. Perhaps it would be better to arm dwarf cavalry with crossbows or bows, allowing them to move quickly and use their mobility to flank enemy formations and attack from the side or rear. This tactic could be effective, but it's not foolproof either. If the enemy manages to regroup or send in fresh cavalry units, the dwarven riders will likely lose since horses are faster. Wild boars can run at speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour, while horses gallop at around 65 kilometers per hour. So in such situations, much depends on the terrain and the cunning of their commanders. Despite their strengths, dwarves aren't an unstoppable force. This race can be defeated in battle too. Still, they're clearly formidable and dangerous opponents, and fighting them won't be a walk in the park. That's that. But how would you arm the dwarves? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. There's plenty more fantasy and warfare content coming soon.